Listen to the steady rhythmic churning of the dark waters of the Cape Fear River flowing past the bustling docks of Wilmington, North Carolina in the autumn of 1898, because that sound is the heartbeat of a miracle that the history books have spent over a century trying to desperately bury and forget. If you walk down Market Street in those days, breathing in the crisp air thick with the smell of cured tobacco, fresh pine lumber, and salt off the Atlantic Ocean, you would see something that was considered absolutely impossible in the post-Civil War American South. You would see a thriving, prosperous, and unapologetically successful black middle class operating in broad daylight. This was not a community merely surviving in the shadows. This was a community that was rapidly building wealth, power, and dignity. Wilmington was the largest and most economically vital city in the state, and it was a shining beacon of what Reconstruction was actually supposed to look like before the politicians in Washington turned their backs. Black men were not just working as laborious on the docks, they were the architects, the doctors, the tailors, the restaurant owners, and the skilled artisans driving the local economy. They served on the city council, they worked as magistrates, they walked a beat as fully uniformed police officers armed and authorized to arrest white citizens who broke the law. The city was governed by a brilliant and highly unusual political alliance known as the Fusion Coalition, which brought together black Republicans and poor white populist farmers who had realized they had far more in common with each other economically than they ever did with the incredibly wealthy aristocratic white elite who had dragged the South into the catastrophic Civil War in the first place. This fusion government had legitimately and fairly won the elections, sweeping into power and proving that interracial democracy could actually function efficiently and equitably. But to the old white Democratic elite, the wealthy plantation owners, the railroad barons, and the Confederate veterans who still dominated the upper echelons of society, this functioning interracial democracy was not a miracle, it was a terrifying existential threat that had to be completely eradicated from the face of the earth. They looked at black men wearing police uniforms and black men serving as city aldermen, and they felt a sickening loss of the absolute total control they believed was their divine right. And the loudest, most fearless voice representing this booming black prosperity belonged to a man named Alexander Manly, the brilliant and courageous editor of the Daily Record, which was the only black-owned daily newspaper in the entire state of North Carolina and reportedly one of the only ones in the entire country. Manly was a man who refused to bite his tongue, who used his printing press as a powerful weapon to expose hypocrisy, demand equal rights, and defend the honor of the black community against the relentless racist propaganda printed by the white newspapers. His printing press clicking and clacking late into the night was the undisputed intellectual fortress of black Wilmington, and the white elite knew that if they wanted to break the spirit of the city, they had to destroy Alexander Manly and smash his press into 1,000 pieces. But before we walk down these dark cobblestone streets and witness the meticulously planned murder of an entire American city, I need you to stand up and be counted. So drop your city in the comments right now to map out our global battalion, because the only way we fight back against the deliberate erasure of history is by building an army of people across the world who refuse to let these ghosts fade into the darkness. The white supremacist elite, led by a ruthless, brilliant, and entirely morally bankrupt political strategist named Furnifold Simmons, decided that they could not defeat the Fusion Coalition at the ballot box with ideas or policies, so they would defeat them with psychological warfare and overwhelming military-grade violence. Simmons initiated what he proudly and publicly called the White Supremacy Campaign of 1898, a heavily funded, highly coordinated statewide conspiracy to steal the upcoming November elections and physically overthrow the legitimate government of Wilmington. He enlisted the help of violent incendiary speakers like Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer and washed-up politician who traveled across the state delivering fiery, blood-soaked speeches telling white crowds that they needed to choke the Cape Fear River with black carcasses rather than let black men continue to vote and hold office. The rhetoric was not a metaphor, it was a direct literal call to arms, and the white population of the state answered that call with terrifying enthusiasm. The campaign was backed by the state's most powerful white newspapers, completely dropping any pretense of journalistic integrity, and instead functioning as a daily fire hose of vicious racist propaganda, printing horrific fabricated stories of black men terrorizing white neighborhoods, drawing grotesque political cartoons that depicted black political power as a monstrous vampire draining the blood of the state. They were deliberately systematically manufacturing a completely fake crisis, a phantom race war designed to completely terrify the white working class and blind them to the fact that they were being manipulated by the ultra-wealthy elite. And this propaganda campaign was backed by cold hard steel. The Democratic Party leadership did not just rely on angry farmers with pitchforks, they financed the creation of a massive private paramilitary organization known as the Red Shirts. These were bands of heavily armed, ruthless white men who rode on horseback wearing bright crimson shirts designed specifically to look like a bloody warning, riding through black neighborhoods in the dead of night, firing their weapons into the air, dragging people from their beds, and violently beating anyone who even dared to speak about voting in the upcoming election. The city of Wilmington was rapidly transforming from a beacon of progress into an occupied military zone. The white elite began quietly purchasing an astonishing amount of modern weaponry, completely emptying the shelves of every hardware and sporting goods store in the surrounding counties. We are not talking about old rusty Civil War muskets, we are talking about the rapid acquisition of state-of-the-art repeating firearms. They bought crates of the brand new Winchester Model 1894 lever action rifles, weapons that could lay down a devastating volume of fire in seconds. They bought hundreds of heavy-caliber Colt single-action Army revolvers. They were arming themselves for a full-scale urban war. And the most chilling acquisition of all was a brand new rapid-fire Colt machine gun, a terrifying piece of modern military technology capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute, which the white leaders proudly mounted on the back of a horse-drawn wagon explicitly to parade it through the streets of black neighborhoods as the ultimate weapon of psychological terror. The message was brutally clear: if you go to the polls, if you try to exercise your constitutional rights, we will physically mow you down in the streets. As the November election rapidly approached, the atmosphere in Wilmington became completely suffocating. Alexander Manly continued to print the truth in the Daily Record, refusing to back down, even as his life was threatened daily, even as armed men loitered outside his printing office staring through the windows. The black community of Wilmington desperately appealed to the federal government, sending frantic telegrams to President William McKinley in Washington, begging for federal marshals, begging for military protection, warning the president that a massive, heavily armed mob was openly planning to overthrow the local government and murder its citizens. But McKinley, a Republican president who was entirely focused on the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, and who had absolutely no political desire to intervene in Southern racial politics, simply ignored their pleas, leaving the black citizens of Wilmington entirely trapped and completely abandoned to their fate. On Election Day, November 8, 1898, the streets of Wilmington looked like a war zone. Armed red shirts completely blockaded the polling stations, standing by the ballot boxes with their Winchester rifles resting casually on their shoulders, glaring at any black man brave enough to approach. They intimidated voters, they violently forced fusionist election judges to abandon their posts, and they brazenly stuffed the ballot boxes with thousands of fraudulent Democratic votes. Through a campaign of absolute unmitigated terror, the white supremacists successfully stole the county and state elections, but due to the staggered nature of local terms, the mayor of Wilmington and the board of aldermen, the actual local government, were not up for re-election and were still legally in power, holding their offices under the mandate of the law. For Alfred Moore Waddell and the violent mob of white supremacists, simply winning the state legislature through fraud was not nearly enough. They did not want to wait months or years to gradually legally take back control of the city. They wanted the fusionist government gone immediately, and they wanted to completely permanently break the economic and political spine of the black community. The very next morning, November 9th, a massive crowd of over 1,000 angry, heavily armed white men gathered at the local courthouse demanding immediate action. Waddell stood before them, his face red with rage, and read a document they called the White Declaration of Independence, a staggering piece of racist arrogance that formally declared that the city of Wilmington would never again be ruled by men of African descent, and demanded the immediate expulsion of Alexander Manly and the total shutdown of his printing press. Waddell then summoned a group of prominent local black leaders, a committee of colored citizens, dragging them into a hostile room filled with armed men, and gave them an impossible, terrifying ultimatum. He handed them a copy of the declaration and told them they had exactly until 7:30 the next morning to force Alexander Manly to leave the city forever and shut down his newspaper, or the white mob would do it for them with extreme violence. He was holding a gun to the head of the entire city. The black leaders, completely terrified and knowing they had absolutely no military defense against a mob armed with machine guns and repeating rifles, desperately agreed to the terms, trying to save the lives of their families. They rushed out to find Alexander Manly, but Manly, having received numerous death threats and knowing he was the primary target of the mobbist bloodlust, had already been secretly smuggled out of the city, hiding in the woods before slipping away onto a northbound train, effectively saving his own life but leaving his beloved newspaper behind. The black leaders quickly drafted a letter to Waddell urgently stating that Manly was gone and that the printing press was closed, begging the white mob to stand down and keep the peace. They gave the urgent letter to a black lawyer named Armand Scott, telling him to deliver it immediately to Waddell's home to meet the deadline. But the streets were completely crawling with armed red shirts, enforcing a violent curfew and heavily patrolling every intersection. Scott, terrified of being lynched in the dark if he was caught moving through the white neighborhoods carrying a message, decided he could not safely deliver the letter directly to Waddell's door by hand. Instead, in a desperate, tragically fateful decision, he placed the letter containing their total surrender into the regular mail system, hoping it would reach Waddell in the morning deliveries. It was a completely understandable decision made under the threat of death, but it was the exact excuse the white mob had been eagerly waiting for. The sun rose on the morning of November 10, 1898, illuminating a city wound incredibly tight, completely holding its breath. The air was cold and brittle. At the massive brick army of the Wilmington Light Infantry, hundreds of white men began to gather long before the 7:30 deadline. These were not just poor, uneducated thugs. These were the bankers, the lawyers, the merchants, the prominent clergymen, and the aristocratic elite of the city, standing shoulder to shoulder with the red shirts, checking the chambers of their Colt revolvers and sliding brass cartridges into the loading gates of their Winchesters. Alfred Moore Waddell stood at the front of the mob holding a pocket watch, watching the minute hand slowly tick toward the deadline. He knew the letter of surrender was likely in the mail. He knew the black community had submitted to his demands. He knew Alexander Manly was already miles away, but he simply did not care. This was never really about the newspaper, and it was never really about the election. It was about the brutal performative display of absolute racial dominance. When the clock struck 7:30 and no messenger had physically arrived, Waddell snapped his watch shut and turned to the massive, heavily armed crowd, his eyes burning with a dark, violent intensity. He raised his rifle into the air and commanded the mob to march. The single most devastating, horrific, and entirely unpunished armed rebellion on American soil was about to begin. The sound of over 1,000 heavily armed men marching in unison down the cobblestone streets of an American city is not a sound you can ever forget, because it is the mechanical grinding noise of a society deciding to completely consume itself. The white mob moved through the crisp November air of Wilmington like a massive dark tidal wave of iron and hatred, led by Alfred Moore Waddell, who marched at the front with the self-righteous fury of a man who believed he was doing the violent work of God. They did not wear masks, they did not hide in the shadows of the night, they marched in broad daylight, wearing their tailored suits, their clerical collars, and their blood-red shirts, because when you have the absolute blessing of the state and the total silence of the federal government, you do not need to hide your face to commit a massacre. The black citizens of Wilmington, watching from behind the thin-drawn curtains of their homes, held their children tight and prayed for a miracle that was never going to come. They watched the men they had worked for, the men they had bought groceries from, the men they had passed on the street just yesterday, now marching past their windows, gripping Winchester repeating rifles and Colt revolvers with their eyes fixed on destruction. The mob reached the two-story wood-frame building known as Love and Charity Hall, which housed the offices of Alexander Manly's Daily Record, and the atmosphere in the streets suddenly shattered. Waddell did not knock, he did not ask for the keys, he simply gave the order, and the men stepped forward with heavy iron crowbars and axes, violently smashing the front doors into splintered wood. The mob poured into the building like a swarm of locusts, tearing through the offices with a frantic, joyful malice. They were not just looking to shut down a business, they wanted to completely obliterate the physical manifestation of black intelligence and defiance. They found the heavy iron printing press the heart and soul of the newspaper, and they went to work destroying it with sledgehammers, shattering the delicate gears, snapping the heavy levers, and violently overturning the typecases, spilling thousands of tiny metal letters across the wooden floorboards, silencing the words before they could ever be printed. But smashing the press was not enough to satisfy the deep primal bloodlust that had been deliberately stoked by months of vicious political propaganda. Someone in the crowd produced cans of highly flammable kerosene and began splashing the liquid across the walls, across the scattered papers, across the splintered remains of the doors. A match was struck and dropped into the puddles of fuel, and within seconds Love and Charity Hall erupted into a towering inferno. The flames rapidly climbed the wooden walls, bursting through the roof and sending a massive thick column of black smoke high into the bright blue autumn sky. That column of smoke was visible from almost every single neighborhood in Wilmington, and it served as a terrifying visual signal to the rest of the city that the rules of civilization had just been officially suspended and the purge had begun. As the building burned, the intense heat pushed the mob back into the street, and a dangerous psychological shift occurred within the crowd. They had tasted destruction, they had broken the law without any consequence, and now the adrenaline was pumping violently through their veins. The fire alarm bells began to ring wildly across the city, drawing out the local fire departments, but when the firemen arrived, they were met by armed white men who ordered them at gunpoint to let the Daily Record burn to the ground, restricting their hoses only to protect the neighboring white-owned properties. The mob stood and cheered as the roof collapsed in a shower of brilliant orange sparks, but as the flames began to die down, the crowd grew restless. They needed a new target. Suddenly, a rumor whipped through the armed men like an electric current, a completely fabricated shout from the back of the crowd claiming that black men in the nearby Brooklyn neighborhood were arming themselves and firing on white citizens. It was a lie, a deliberate tactical lie designed to ignite the powder keg, but it was exactly the excuse the mob was begging for. With Waddell screaming orders, the massive armed force pivoted away from the smoldering ruins of the newspaper and began a rapid, terrifying march toward Brooklyn, the vibrant, beating heart of black Wilmington. In the Brooklyn neighborhood, the black residents had seen the smoke, they had heard the fire bells, and they knew exactly what was coming for them. Small groups of terrified but determined black men began to gather at the major street corners, armed with whatever they could find: old hunting shotguns, small caliber pocket pistols, wooden clubs, and even heavy stones. They were not an organized army, they were simply desperate fathers and sons trying to form a human barricade between a heavily armed white supremacist death squad and the homes where their families were hiding. When the vanguard of the white mob reached the edge of the neighborhood, the tension snapped like a dry twig under a heavy boot. It is impossible to know exactly who fired the first shot in the chaos, but the moment the sharp crack of a pistol echoed through the streets, the white mob unleashed a devastating, ungodly monsoon of lead into the black neighborhoods. Hundreds of lever action rifles fired simultaneously, tearing through the thin wooden walls of the houses, shattering windows, and ripping through the bodies of the men standing in the streets. The black defenders, vastly outnumbered and hopelessly outgunned, returned fire as best they could, but it was like trying to stop a hurricane with a handful of sand. And then the true nightmare arrived. Rolling down the cobblestone streets, pulled by a sweating horse, came the wagon carrying the Colt rapid-fire machine gun. The white men operating the gun swung the heavy brass barrel toward the residential streets and cranked the handle. The mechanical stuttering roar of the machine gun was a sound of pure modern industrial death, a sound that most people in America had never heard outside of a military battlefield. The heavy caliber bullets tore through the neighborhood with devastating, indiscriminate precision, chewing through the wooden fences, slicing through the porches, and striking down anyone who dared to run across the street. Men who were simply trying to sprint home from their jobs at the docks were caught in the crossfire, their bodies practically ripped in half by the overwhelming volume of fire. Women clutching their infants threw themselves flat onto their floorboards, screaming in absolute terror, as the bullets punched holes directly through their living rooms, sending terrifying showers of plaster and wood splinters down upon them. This was no longer a riot, this was a systematic military massacre sanctioned by the highest levels of local society. And where were the police? Where were the forces of law and order that were supposed to protect the innocent citizens of Wilmington? The white police officers had either stripped off their badges and joined the mob directly, or they were standing idly on the street corners watching the slaughter with a quiet, approving satisfaction. The black police officers who had proudly walked those very same streets just hours before had been violently cornered by armed men, stripped of their badges, stripped of their weapons at gunpoint, and told to run for their lives or be murdered on the spot. The very concept of law enforcement had completely evaporated, replaced by the absolute violent tyranny of the mob. But the betrayal went even deeper than the local police. As the gunfire echoed across the city, the state authorities officially deployed the Wilmington Light Infantry and the Naval Reserves ostensibly to quell the violence and restore order to the chaotic streets. These were official state-sanctioned military units wearing government uniforms and carrying government-issued weapons. But when these troops marched into the Brooklyn neighborhood, they did not disarm the white mob, they did not arrest the men firing rifles into civilian homes, they actively joined them. The military units essentially became the heavily armed shock troops of the white supremacist insurrection, marching side by side with the red shirts, coordinating their fire and hunting down black citizens with military efficiency. The federal government, the state government, the local government, the police, and the military had all completely unified in a singular horrifying effort to murder the black population of Wilmington. As the death toll began to rapidly climb, the streets ran slick with blood. Bodies were left exactly where they fell in the dirt in the gutters on the front porches as a grotesque warning to anyone who survived. The white mob roamed from house to house, kicking down doors, dragging terrified men out by their collars and executing them in the streets without a second thought. For the black citizens of Wilmington, it became completely horrifyingly clear that staying in their homes meant certain death. A desperate, panicked mass exodus began. Thousands of people, men, women, the elderly, and tiny children burst out of their back doors, abandoning everything they owned, the businesses they had built, the wealth they had accumulated, the lives they had painstakingly constructed, and began to run wildly toward the dense, unforgiving swamps that surrounded the city. The November air was brutally cold, dropping near freezing as the sun began to set, but the people did not stop running. They plunged into the icy, muddy waters of the Cape Fear River swamps, tearing their clothes on the thick briars, sinking up to their knees in the dark muck, listening to the relentless, terrifying sound of gunfire echoing from the city they used to call home. Mothers held their hands tightly over the mouths of their crying babies, terrified that even the slightest sound would draw the heavily armed white patrols that were actively hunting the perimeter of the woods, looking for stragglers to shoot for sport. Thousands of American citizens were suddenly reduced to terrified refugees in their own country, shivering in the freezing mud, stripped of their dignity, their property, and their rights simply because they had dared to believe they were equal. And while the swamps filled with the quiet, agonizing sobs of the displaced and the streets of the Brooklyn neighborhood burned, an entirely different kind of violence was taking place in the heart of the city, an administrative violence, a cold, calculated political coup d'etat that would completely finalize the total destruction of democratic Wilmington and forever alter the course of American history. While the Brooklyn neighborhood burned and the Cape Fear River swamps filled with terrified refugees shivering in the freezing mud, Alfred Moore Waddle, and his inner circle of white supremacist orchestrators were executing the final phase of their terrifying master plan in the very heart of downtown Wilmington. They marched their heavily armed militia away from the slaughter in the residential streets and headed directly for City Hall, where the legally elected fusionist government, including the white Republican Mayor Silas Wright and the racially integrated Board of Aldermen, were still officially in power. Waddell was not satisfied with simply stealing the state legislature through ballot box stuffing, and he was not satisfied with destroying the Daily Record. He wanted absolute total control of the city immediately, and he was willing to achieve it through a blatant armed coup d'etat. This was an unprecedented action in the history of the United States, a complete violent overthrow of a legally elected municipal government on American soil. When Waddell and his men burst into City Hall, the building was immediately surrounded by hundreds of red shirts gripping their Winchester rifles, making it horrifyingly clear that nobody was going to leave the building alive unless they complied with the mob's demands. Inside the chambers, Waddell orchestrated a chilling, completely illegal mock administrative procedure that was essentially a bureaucratic execution at gunpoint. They dragged the fusionist aldermen into the room one by one. There was no debate, there was no legal proceeding, there was simply the cold hard barrel of a Colt revolver and a pre-written letter of resignation. The armed men demanded that each elected official sign the paper, completely surrendering their office to the white supremacists. As soon as a fusionist alderman, trembling under the threat of immediate death, signed his resignation, Waddell's men would immediately illegally vote to replace him with one of their own hand-picked white Democratic loyalists. They did this systematically, methodically, replacing the entire city government seat by seat until the only man left was Mayor Silas Wright. Wright was a white Republican who had believed in the fusionist coalition, but sitting in that room surrounded by men who had just orchestrated a mass murder in the streets outside, he knew that the law was completely dead in Wilmington. With heavily armed men standing over his shoulders, Wright was forced to sign his own resignation, handing over the highest office in the city. The newly appointed, entirely illegal, all-white Board of Aldermen then immediately voted to name Alfred Moore Waddell the new mayor of Wilmington. In a matter of hours, Waddell had gone from a washed-up, bitter former Confederate officer to the undisputed dictator of the largest city in North Carolina, having achieved his power exclusively through domestic terrorism and mass murder. But the coup was not finished with the capture of the mayor's office. Waddell and his new illegitimate government immediately authorized a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing and political banishment that would guarantee the fusionist coalition could never rise again. They had compiled a meticulous hit list of the most prominent, successful, and influential black citizens in Wilmington: the businessmen, the pastors, the lawyers, the real estate owners, and the political organizers. They also included the leading white Republicans who had dared to ally with the black community. Armed squads of red shirts were dispatched across the city, kicking down doors and dragging these prominent men from their homes, not to kill them but to completely humiliate and exile them. The mob forced these men, including the former police chief and the leading black magistrates, to march at gunpoint through the streets of Wilmington toward the train station. Hundreds of white citizens lined the streets, jeering, spitting, and throwing rocks at the captive leaders as they were paraded like prisoners of war through the city they had helped build. At the train station, the armed guards forced the exiled men onto northbound trains, telling them with absolute chilling certainty that if they ever returned to Wilmington, they would be lynched on sight. The men were forced to leave everything behind: their families, their bank accounts, their properties, their entire lives completely stolen by the white supremacist mob in a single afternoon. As the trains pulled away from the station, carrying the intellectual and economic leadership of black Wilmington into permanent exile, the city plunged into a dark, terrifying night. Out in the freezing swamps surrounding the city, the nightmare was only just beginning for the thousands of black refugees who had fled the gunfire. The temperature dropped drastically and a cold, biting rain began to fall, turning the muddy bogs into a freezing hell. Families huddled tightly together under the dripping branches of the pine trees with absolutely no shelter, no food, and no warm clothing. Mothers desperately tried to quiet their crying infants, terrified that the sound would draw the armed white patrols that were still roaming the perimeter of the woods, holding lanterns and rifles, actively hunting for anyone who tried to return to the city. The historical records suggest that several infants and elderly people died from exposure in the freezing mud that night, their fragile bodies completely unable to withstand the brutal elements and the sheer psychological terror of the situation. Their deaths were never officially recorded, their names never added to the official casualty lists of the massacre, but their blood is just as surely on the hands of the white mob as the men who were shot in the streets. And while the citizens of Wilmington froze in the swamps and the new illegitimate government consolidated its violent grip on the city, the most deafening, terrifying silence of all was emanating from Washington, D.C. President William McKinley, sitting comfortably in the Oval Office, was receiving a constant, frantic stream of telegraphs and intelligence reports detailing the absolute collapse of democracy in North Carolina. He was receiving first-hand accounts of the machine gun being fired into residential neighborhoods, the forced resignations at gunpoint, the banishment of citizens, and the mass exodus into the swamps. The President of the United States had the constitutional authority, he had the federal troops, and he had the absolute moral obligation to intervene to declare martial law, to arrest the orchestrators of the coup, and to restore the legally elected government. But McKinley made a cold, calculated, completely morally bankrupt political decision. He looked at the electoral map, he looked at the rising power of the Southern Democrats, and he decided that the lives and the constitutional rights of the black citizens of Wilmington were simply not worth the political capital it would cost to save them. The federal government, the institution that had passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, the institution that had fought a bloody civil war to supposedly guarantee equality, completely abandoned the city of Wilmington to the violent whims of a racist mob. The silence from the White House was the ultimate betrayal. It was the final crushing blow that proved to the white supremacists across the entire South that they could commit treason and mass murder without any fear of federal consequence. In the days following the massacre, the new illegitimate government led by Waddell began a massive, highly coordinated propaganda campaign to completely control the narrative of what had just happened. They knew that the sight of bodies floating in the Cape Fear River and the bullet-riddled homes in Brooklyn would eventually draw the attention of the northern press, so they immediately began feeding a completely fabricated story to the national newspapers. They claimed that the black citizens of Wilmington had started a violent race riot, that they were planning to attack white women, and that the heroic white citizens had simply armed themselves to restore law and order. The national newspapers, eager for sensational headlines and completely steeped in their own racist assumptions, printed the lies exactly as Waddell and Simmons dictated them. The victims were magically transformed into the violent aggressors, and the murderers were celebrated as the saviors of civilization. The exact death toll of the Wilmington Massacre will never be known because the perpetrators were the ones keeping the records. The official government reports claimed that only a handful of people died, perhaps 10 or 14, but oral histories from the black community and later historical investigations suggest that the true number is exponentially higher, possibly stretching into the hundreds. Witnesses describe seeing wagons pile high with black bodies being driven toward the river, where they were unceremoniously dumped into the dark waters to completely erase the evidence of the slaughter. Others were buried in unmarked mass graves, their existences completely scrubbed from the official history of the city. The economic devastation was just as absolute as the physical destruction. In the weeks and months following the coup, the thousands of black citizens who had fled into the swamps slowly, cautiously began to emerge, only to find that their jobs had been given to white men, their properties had been seized or sold at massive discounts to white investors, and their political rights had been completely evaporated. The thriving, prosperous black middle class that had made Wilmington a beacon of hope was completely annihilated. Over 2,000 black citizens permanently left the city, effectively changing Wilmington from a majority black city into a majority white city, cementing the demographic and economic dominance of the white supremacist regime for generations to come. The Wilmington insurrection was not just an isolated tragedy, it was a highly successful, incredibly lethal blueprint for the total disenfranchisement of black Americans across the South. The conspirators in North Carolina had proven that you could use overwhelming violence to steal an election, completely overthrow a government, and rewrite the state constitution to permanently strip black citizens of the right to vote, and the federal government would do absolutely nothing to stop you. Following the success of the Wilmington coup, white supremacists across the South rapidly adopted these exact same violent tactics, implementing poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, completely destroying the political gains of Reconstruction and plunging the nation into the dark, brutal era of Jim Crow. The men who orchestrated this horrific violence, Alfred Moore, Waddell, Furnifold, Simmons, and their wealthy backers, never faced a single day in a courtroom. They were never charged with murder, treason, or civil rights violations. Instead, they were heavily rewarded by the state of North Carolina. They went on to serve as highly respected United States senators, governors, and prominent civic leaders, their names carved into the stone of public buildings, and their violent legacy celebrated as a triumph of Southern heritage. The true history of what happened in Wilmington was actively, intentionally suppressed for nearly a century, passed down only in whispered stories within the black families who survived the terror, while the official state textbooks taught generations of children that the white mob was the heroic victim of a corrupt black administration. The complete erasure of this history was the final violent act of the coup, an attempt to murder the truth just as brutally as they had murdered the citizens of Brooklyn. But the truth is incredibly resilient. It is a stubborn root that refuses to die even when it is buried under a century of lies. The voices of those who were shot in the streets, the voices of those who froze in the swamps, the voices of those who were banished from their homes on the trains are echoing through the decades, demanding to be heard, demanding to be remembered, demanding that we recognize the brutal, fragile reality of our own democracy.